Greetings, family. Welcome to the African Exodus show. I'm your host, Tierney Cherie, here to you with another video. Before we get started with today's segment, I want to remind you, if you have not and you want to get notifications from this channel, you can add yourself to my Telegram channel. That is a decentralized platform that I use to update anytime that I post a video. With that, let's get started with African and world news. We have some updates on the conflict happening in Niger. I'm sure many of you are well aware by now that there was a coup inside of Niger. Many of you also are probably aware of the ECOWAS, which is the economic zone inside of West Africa that encompasses the country of Niger, as well as a number of other countries that have had coups. And a lot of things have been said recently that bring up the issue whether or not the ECOWAS are going to go beyond their mandate, which is an economic zone, and actually try to use force in order to topple these coups that are happening inside of the West African region. So let's go with the first story. Niger's military rulers have accused France of unilaterally releasing terrorists into the country. That's right, France, the country that was supposedly helping Niger to get rid of the terrorist elements. Niger is now accusing this country of actually releasing terrorists into Niger. And you should know, if that is the case, which I believe that many of these terrorist groups are being released into Africa by Western puppets, that means that all of the questions of the relationship between the West and Africa have to hinge on the relationship of terrorism to being the gateway to allowing them to actually inhabit African regions. So Niger's new military rulers on Wednesday accused France, the country's traditional ally, of having unilaterally freed captured terrorists, a term used for jihadists, and of breaching a ban on the country's airspace. They claimed that France released a number of jihadists who gathered to plan an attack on military positions in the tri-border area, a hotspot region where the frontiers of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali converge. Obviously very relevant because Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali have all had coups as of recently. So it says events of an extreme gravity are unfolding in Niger as a result of the behavior of the French forces and their accomplices, according to the statement issued by the new regime called the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland. For some context, sometimes we forget the relationship that France has to certain countries, and we want to loop all of Africa into one bucket. We should understand the relationship that Niger had with France was very different than the relationship that other African countries have with France, and is probably was the closest ally to France on the African continent. Some of you might remember a few months ago, I actually reported that France was rebranding its colonialism. It said that they were going to start a new era and that the relationship with Niger was going to be one of friendship, going to be one of working together. And so Niger was going to be the operation. It was going to rebrand France in a positive way inside of the African continent. At least that's what we're told. And so obviously the fact that Niger now has had a coup, as well as former French ally, but really French colony, Burkina Faso, former French colony, Mali, former French colony, Guinea, all of these former French colonies are having these coups. That means that France has seen a toppling of the dream of a French Africa literally falling to pieces. Now, this is the simplistic way of looking at it. There's more complex things happening behind the scenes that we have to talk about, because we have to understand there's an end goal to this. There's an end goal to all of these coups, there's an end goal to all of these interventions, and the end goal is ultimately control. But first, let's talk about Nigeria's Tinubu, the new president of Nigeria. He seeks Senate support for an ECOWAS intervention in Niger. Tinubu is reportedly seeking support to intervene against the ruling military in Niger, where a coup removed the democratically elected government. Of course, this is nerve of Nigeria, because what happens in Niger should not have anything to do with Nigeria. And not to mention that Nigeria, their entire relationship with Niger is not one of forced compliance as far as following the mandates of the international order. Yet they're acting like Niger is a part of their territory, which brings the ECOWAS back into question, because the ECOWAS, if you don't remember, it's really not supposed to be a military alliance at all. It's really supposed to be an economic alliance. When you look and read at how it's spelt out, it's about regional cooperation. It's about trying to have a regional economy. Nothing in it says that ECOWAS is going to be a military regime where if one country decides to liberate itself, or that's what it seems that one country might be doing, that we're going to enforce and make that country keep their government as it is. So that was never a part of it. So why is it now that we see that ECOWAS is using force and in a situation where it was never supposed to be built for that? And that makes you think probably ECOWAS is built to do exactly what it's doing all along. Now, Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu has released a letter to his country's Senate asking its members to back a regional military intervention in neighboring Niger, where a coup toppled the democratically elected government of Mohamed Bazoum last week. Local daily The Cable reported on Friday that Tinubu requested for military buildup and deployment of personnel for military intervention to enforce compliance of the military junta in Niger should they remain recalcitrant. Regional powerhouse Nigeria currently holds the rotating presidency of the Economic Community of West African States, which imposed sanctions on Niger and on Sunday gave the putschists a week to restore Bazoum to power or risk possible armed intervention. Sanctions imposed on Niger by the 15-member ECOWAS include border closure, suspension of all financial and commercial ties with the country. The Central Bank of West African States canceled a plan of 30 billion CFA franc and bond issuance by Niger on Monday. ECOWAS also dispatched a delegation to Niger headed by former Nigerian leader Abdul Salami Abu Bakr to negotiate the soldiers who seized power, but the team left without meeting the general Abdurrahman Tichinani, the coup leader. ECOWAS has been struggling to contain a military backslide in West Africa in the last 2 years. Obviously, this has included takeovers in Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and if you don't remember, there's also an attempted coup inside of Guinea-Bissau. Tinubu, who is yet to appoint ministers for defense and foreign affairs, despite sending a list of 48 ministerial nominees to parliament, is eager to stamp his authority in the region derided as the coup belt, which is clearly what we see happening now that Nigeria is the chair of the ECOWAS. They want to be the forceful one. They want to drive the narrative that Nigeria is not going to tolerate what former leads of the ECOWAS has tolerated. So this is how they're trying to make their mark inside of the international realm with a new president who's going to try to enforce the idea that a democratically elected government by their standards is the protocol for African countries. And Nigeria has the largest armed forces in the region. All U.S. forces, let's be clear. So Nigeria has the largest armed forces in the region and previously contributed the most of the troops to the regional peacekeeping missions is said to lead any intervention in Niger. Western countries have also strongly condemned the July 26th coup. Many of them saw Niger as the last reliable partner in efforts to battle armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the Sahel region. Several Western nations have given aid, even though Niger is one of the poorest countries in the world and relies on outside help for nearly half of its annual budget. Just some more context about Niger. Not only was it one of the closest U.S. allies in the region, but also Niger is very rich in uranium, and uranium is something that is used for, you guessed it, nuclear weapons. So this is another irony that Africa doesn't have any nuclear weapons, despite the fact that the uranium reserves in Africa are so great that the West depends on it. But this is a big reason why a coup in Niger is going to be different than other coups. It's going to be treated differently. Not to mention, they also have other really rich minerals, such as things that are used for our cell phones. So a coup in Niger, the place that is allowing the West to have things like nuclear weapons, that's going to send a different message. So I hope we understand that this is not a simple coup. This really could mean an international war, at least in the minds of the West. Now, this is what they want us to think. Now, I'm going to give you the other side of this conflict. What do I believe? In the greatest scheme of pan-Africanism. I would hope that this is all authentic movements that are happening, that the people of Niger are rising up and pushing these leaders out of power. I would hope that this has nothing to do with the West, that this has nothing to do with the Western agenda or even the New World Order agenda. In a perfect world, that would be my hope, that would be my plea. Do I think that? I've said last week, and I'll say it again, I have to see what happens, but more that I'm seeing, the more I'm actually thinking that this is a false flag. Basically, they're trying to get us to move in a direction that is going to allow them to come in full force into the African continent. And the reason I think that is because just like the coup in Mali, just like the coup in Burkina Faso, we're again seeing that this coup is being led by a military junta, okay, not people who were of the community, not people who were organizing amongst the community. This is led by a military junta. And on top of that, a military junta that was trained by who? The United States of America. So let's read this new article. Niger mutiny. Another U.S. trained military officer led coup. Yes, another one. So I'm going to jump around this article. It's quite long, but I want to jump around and hit certain spots. So this says, troops from Niger ousted the country's democratically elected president, Mohamed Bazoum, last week. One of the coup leaders had previously received training from the U.S. government, becoming the 11th coup in the region led by U.S. trained forces. Not a coincidence. The first time it might have been a coincidence. I think it might have been Mali, or if it wasn't, it was Burkina Faso, where a lot of people were saying this guy was trained by the U.S., he must be a plant, and, that's what people were saying. And I said, let's see more of what happens first, because let's not forget that Thomas Sankara, the great African leader, he was formerly a part of he was formerly trained by France. So we can't just write someone off because they've received training from someone. But when you see a trend happening, and you understand the broad apparatus of the Central Intelligence Agency, the most powerful counterintelligence agency in the world, they watch everything. I'm sure if they were interested enough, they're watching this video. They're watching the conversations that you're having, if they're interested enough. They're watching the discourse between Africans in the continent and the diaspora. They're watching the anti-French sentiment. They're watching China and Africa. They're watching all these things. Not only are they watching on it, they're always acting on it. They're always employing people to act on it. They're always controlling things. We just don't see it. So I had a hard time believing when it's a string of the same thing happening, that it's just a coincidence. Now, let's read some more. It says, it's still shaking out as to who the real power players in the junta are, as I reported for The Intercept last week. One of them is the Brigadier, I don't know if I said that right, General Musa Salalou Bormu, who is the chief of the Special Operations Forces in Niger. He's been a darling of the U.S. government for many years. Let me say that again. General Musa Salalou Bormu, he is the chief of the Special Operations Forces in Niger. He's been a darling of the U.S. government for many years. He was trained in the United States at Fort Benning, since renamed, but this has been a school for foreign military officers for years, and also in Washington at the National Defense University. At least those two, likely more. So this is the guy who's leading this coup in Niger. Have to remember context of these things. Who has not intervened inside of all these coups? Who has not been disturbed enough to put their gavel down? Who we know will do so if they wanted to. You have not seen the United States government intervene. Instead, we've seen France, who has been kind of, not necessarily military interventions, but has been kind of doing slick stuff behind the scenes, sending their troops to surveil an area, having airplanes fly over certain places. They've been doing things behind the scenes, and I'm sure they have had something to do with the rise in terrorist attacks in certain regions. But we haven't seen direct act of aggression from these colonizers who are imperialists, who have far more military might than the African continent. I'm sorry for all of you who have a romanticized view of the military in Africa, but understand the military in Africa is funded by the West, controlled by the West. That is who they are. So I haven't seen a stark reminder to the African continent of who's in control by their colonizers. So let's go on. It says, yeah, there's a great deal of anti-French sentiment in the Western Sahel in the countries that I talked about. Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and the United States has been really wired into the French military response there. They aided France in a number of ways with the ISR intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and worked alongside French troops. But the militaries in these countries and the civilian populations have really soured on the French, who, as you mentioned, the colonial relationship there has never really gone away. They are still treated as French de facto colonies in many ways. French corporations dominate the landscape there. And the people see them as very extractive, taking mineral wealth, uranium, and people want those resources back and don't think the French should have their hands on them. And I think the United States has, because they're so wired in with the French, has taken on some of the colonial sheen. So obviously, if you know the French and the U.S. are allies, and you've seen the French and the United States come together to many times, presently in the past, to topple legitimate leaders like a Thomas Sankara, for example, or like a Muammar Gaddafi. So when you see that happening, you know that French presence and the United States presence is not coincidental. They're allies. They're working together. So the United States, if you pick on what they're saying, has picked up on this anti-French sentiment. This anti-French sentiment that really grew out of people understanding that France still maintains an unprecedented amount of control over the African continent. They were picking up on the conversations of the CFA Franks. And that's one thing that we have to realize. We're talking on YouTube. They're listening. This is why we have to be really not necessarily censor the truth, but know who's also hearing what you're saying and know that they are also strategizing in a way to create a counter narrative. So when everyone was angry at France, rightfully so, when everyone was saying their anti-French sentiment, rightfully so, and many people were connecting based on that anger, understand that the United States, who is always the biggest imperialist in the world, bigger than France, bigger than the UK, bigger than anyone else. The United States is number one still today, bar none. The United States is picking up on that. Now, I'll give you more of my theory on this whole thing in a moment, but let's just try to get through this article. So it says, we haven't seen that Wagner is involved in Niger yet, okay? But you can look to neighboring Mali to get an idea of what the playbook might be. And Mali was, like Burkina Faso before it, and Niger, dissatisfied with the current state of counterterrorism in the country. And in all these countries, you had military officers rise up. All of them have been U.S. trained officers. In Mali, even though we trained that officer, we brought Wagner Group in. And my understanding is that Wagner is paid $11 million a month for trainers and advisors, but really they're troops on the ground who are conducting military operations. So let me say a few things about this. I still don't know what to make of the Wagner Group. And so obviously they had people said it was a coup in Russia. Some people said it wasn't a coup. I don't know what to make about them. Share your information, your thoughts on whether they are literally just here for the hire or whether they're actually aligned more so with strongly inside of the Russian government. I don't know. But I do think it's very interesting. These counterterrorism operations is what gave the West license to come into Africa and literally control the militaries there, to launch military operations throughout the continent. This literally gave them license, and this is important to recognize the function that terrorism plays inside of regions that the imperialists want to control. Because I keep saying these so-called terrorists, many times, if not all the time, are being controlled and funded by the same states that are sending troops to fight them. So understand these groups being there inside of Africa, it has everything to do with the West. It has everything to do with the United States. It has everything to do with Europe. It has everything to do with the NATO countries, because they are the ones who want to create a boogeyman that gives them license to invade territories. So what am I making of this? My theory, and it could change because frankly, I'm not there. I don't have the intel. Some of you, if you're close to the region or have people closer to the region, you might have more intel. But just from what I've seen, I am not convinced that these coups are not being done and being caused by the West in order to see an intervention, a military intervention into the African continent. I'm leaning towards that. I don't believe that these are authentic coups. I don't believe that these are people who are authentically about the people. I always have a suspicion when it's a military coup, unless you see the military having a certain type of affinity for the community. And I'm not saying that none of these coups have, but the level of suspicion should always be higher for military coups because, as we said, in the African continent, militaries are controlled by the West most times, right? So I've always had that suspicion. I've always had the suspicion of some of the coup leaders having been trained by the U.S. and now finding out more of the coup leaders were actually being trained by the U.S. I always have suspicion of that. The issue comes, is this something that's being done to see an internal war in the African continent? If so, why? I think so. And then why, the reason for that why I believe is because if you don't know, like I said, the U.S. has been watching. The U.S. has been putting out messaging inside of the African diasporic dialogues and inside of the local continental African dialogues in order to try to thwart the Chinese presence inside of Africa. The Russian presence inside of Africa is also something that they deem a threat, but the big one that they're trying to knock out is China, because China is doing so in a way that outpaces the United States. So my belief, my theory, and we will see if I'm right, is that really this is something that's going to possibly lead to a continental war, intercontinental or West African war, where you're going to see these leaders try to get a hold of Niger, because trust me, again, if Niger is enriching uranium, if you think that that country is going to be independent from the globalist system and that you're just going to let that happen, you're kidding yourself. If they don't receive a military intervention, that lets you know right there that Niger is literally being propped up by the United States, because they would not let that happen. But let's just say that was actually to happen, that there was to be a military intervention. I think the purpose of that is to see the proxy war I keep talking about. I believe there's a proxy war in the wind. The United States wants to reassert dominance inside of Africa. The question is, will it be a simple invasion and trying to instill governments that are loyal to the U.S., or will the allies of China, so Russia, namely, and China, are they going to try to do a counterinsurgency or a counter-invasion? We don't know. But that's what I see happening. That's what I foresee. It could be wrong. I'm always open to that, especially with things like this that change as we speak. So certainly, we're going to keep watch of what's happening. And prayerfully, there will not be bloodshed inside of this conflict, because regardless of if it's the people doing it or whether it's United States forces who are trying to instigate it, we know that the people who have no say inside of the situation is more often our people who are the most disenfranchised, who are the population who are going to be most affected. So certainly prayers for our people in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, all of those countries. So Ethiopia could possibly be facing another war, something that is being reported. Now, Ethiopia recently, by the way, said that they have control over the situation, but it's important for us to keep ourselves in the loop on the situation. We know, if you watch this channel, Ethiopia, as identified inside of Holy Scripture, is the actual promised land, the one that we know as Israel, more appropriate, Yasharel. So that is a region that encompasses or is encompassed by the Holy Land. In addition, this particular region, Amhara, if you read the scripture, is literally biblical Israel. So that's why we want to make sure we're keeping abreast of what's happening there. So when Ethiopia's government and rebellious forces from Tigray region agreed in November to end their conflict, diplomats hailed the peace deal as a new dawn for Africa's second most populous nation. Many of you probably remember this. There was the Tigray War. Africa was in shambles over this because, well, we know also that this Tigray Liberation Front was being sponsored by the United States. For whatever reason, many people believe it's for Ethiopia trying to build a dam that would give them power, regional power inside of the region, a threat to Egypt or a perceived threat to Egypt inside of that region. And so there's a lot happening around this, okay? And many of us Many of us remember this piece still coming out. Many people are happy because this war seemed to just be dragging on and dragging on, not to mention the sanctions coming from the West that were hurting the people of Ethiopia, hurting the people of Eritrea. So many of us remember this. It said, for many in the Amhara region, which neighbors Tigray, and fought in support of federal forces during the war, the deal was something very different. A stab in the back, failure to account for Amhara's concerns portended another war. 9 months later, that forecast looks to be coming true. Fierce fighting broke out last week across Amhara between local Fano militiamen and federal forces, leading the government to declare a state of emergency and rush troops to the front of the lines. As clashes rage across cities, both sides appear to agree on the stakes. Nothing less than survival of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government. Fano is an informal militia with no publicly known command structure that draws volunteers from local population. The Fano and the support of the farmers in Amhara public will attempt to defeat the federal security forces in their alliance and ultimately remove Abiy from power, said Tewodros Tirfe, chairman of the Amhara Association of America, a lobby group that supports the Fano cause. Important to say that again, the Amhara Association of America. Amhara is Ethiopia's second most populous region with more than 3 times as many people as Tigray, and part of the Amhara lie just about 50 kilometers or 30 miles from Addis Ababa. Abiy's government is unlikely to survive a sustained mass uprising in the Amhara region, especially given the mounting political and economic crisis around the world, says Adisu Lashitu, a fellow from the Brookings Institute, a think tank. Brookings Institute, underline, that's one of the colonial think tanks, obviously. Amhara residents said Fano fighters had inflicted some losses on the better equipped federal forces, and the government's Temesgen acknowledged on Monday that the militiamen had captured some towns. Now, spoiler alert, it was just put out literally within an hour ago when I checked the news that Ethiopia says that they have control over the situation. So Ethiopian government announced on Wednesday that major towns in the northern Amhara region have been liberated after several days of deadly fighting between the federal forces and local militias. Residents interviewed by AFP also reported the advance of Ethiopian forces. The General Directorate of the State of Emergency, a government body, later claimed that 6 major Amhara towns had been freed from the threat of bandits. The regional capital, Bahir Dar, Lalibela, Gondar, Shua Robit, Deborah Burhan, and Deborah Morkos. A curfew has imposed in all the 6 towns. No official figure on the fighting has been released, but 2 doctors, Bahir Dar and Gondar, violence in this part of Africa's second most populous country. It was just 9 months after the end of the devastating Tigray conflict. So what we have to keep in mind here, I believe that Abiy Ahmed is marked to be dethroned or to be toppled by the West. They still want to get him out of power, and they want to prevent this dam. They do not want Ethiopia. If you understand the politics of the dam would basically put Ethiopia in a position, if they wanted to, they could significantly limit water that would flow to the Nile River that flows up Egypt. Now, the dam is within Ethiopia's borders. The dam is not something that goes outside of their borders, so you would think it's a matter of national sovereignty. But of course, Egypt does not want Ethiopia having that much power, certainly over their destiny, Egypt's destiny, but also over their own destiny, because this would have the potential to really lift Ethiopia and many Ethiopians out of the position that they are in inside of the world, make them have power all over the country, something that's very significant and that we might take for granted if you live in the West. So that's something that would be very significant. So this means that he's still marked. The fact that this militia, no one knows who leads the militia, leads me to believe that the militia is being controlled by, again, the U.S. And obviously the Amhara American Association has to be being controlled by the U.S. So when we see these types of narrative building, doesn't mean that there's zero truth to any narrative. I'm sure that there are atrocities that are happening under the Ethiopian government, I'm sure. But when you see a narrative building from the West, that means that they want to still get this person out of power. And so they might not have the leverage to do so because of the Tigray conflict, and they might be starting a new conflict inside of the Amhara region. At least that's what I read into this, was reading between the lines. So with that, let's go to the next story. This is a significant story, and definitely one that I hope you are paying attention to. They said terrified Peruvian villagers claim they are under attack from 7-foot tall aliens dubbed face pillars as they pled with authorities to send backup. Now, some of you who might not like these types of the conversations about aliens or things like that, watchers, as we know they're correctly called in scripture, you might hear this and say, this is some type of National Enquirer type of newspaper type stuff. It's probably just some made up stuff just to get people excited. But you should know this is actually being reported by Peruvian sources, like actual news sources. And it seems to be that there's something that's happening that could be very significant. Now, it said terrified villagers in a rural Peruvian district have claimed that they have come under attack by 7-foot tall aliens they have dubbed Los Palacaras, or the face pillars. Members of the Iquitu tribe from San Antonio native community have reported mysterious figures in dark-colored hoods attacking the villagers who live in the royal district of Alto Nane, northeast of Lima, Peru. In one such attack, a 15-year-old had been taken to the hospital. According to the community leader Jaro Ritigu, sorry, Spanish speakers, Davila, the teenager narrowly escaped, but as a result of the struggle, they cut part of her neck. Now, according to local media, members of the community are conducting night patrols to protect women, children, and more vulnerable villagers, and have called on authorities to send in the military. Locals describe the extraterrestrials as having large head, yellowish eyes, and said the mysterious figures are immune to their hunting weapons. They claim that they have attacked them every night for nearly a month since July 11th. Latina Noticias, a Peruvian news outlet, quoted Davila as saying he had come face to face with one of the so-called aliens. We have met face to face. His face is hardly visible. I seen his whole body floating at a height of 1 meter, he said, suggesting the being was hovering. The group have now requested a military presence from authorities. However, it reportedly takes a 10-hour river trip to get to the community, Iquitos City. We need support for our community. The children do not sleep, and the mothers stay up all night, Davila said. They appeared to be armored. I shot one of them twice, and he wasn't injured. He rose and disappeared. We're very frightened about what's happening here in our community. He added, their shoes are round-shaped, and they use to float. They use their shoes to float. Their heads are long. They wear a mask, and their eyes are yellowish. They are experts at escaping. It also says some villagers describe the aliens as being like Palacaras, strange beings from folklore that feast on human faces, fat, and organs. I've seen also they're being described as predator inside of Alien versus Predator. This is something that you should know about because a narrative is being built right now. We've been hearing about these beings constantly, whether it's coming from California, whether it's coming from Peru, whether it's coming from DC. We're hearing about these things constantly. And what are we being told about them is that not only are they here, but now we're actually being told that there's violence being done to certain communities because of them. There's a few possibilities as far as what this could be. Obviously, let's deal with the first possibility, the one for people who don't believe in aliens. This could all just be the U.S. military who's dressing up like aliens and wearing different types of suits and hovering. And, if you understand that the military has technology that none of us are even privy to, they could be doing something basically to drive their narrative. And their narrative would be that, oh my, we're under attack. We have to come together and help Peru. That's possible. The other possibility, though, is that this could literally be what they're saying it is. These could be beings from other planets. So if you are someone who has paid attention to these so-called aliens, or watchers more appropriately, you know that they have said that there are different beings. So there are the watchers, or the aliens that are good, and there are the ones that are bad. And so the ones that are bad, people who have experience with these things, they say the ones that are bad, that the ones that are good can help us destroy the ones that are bad. So could this be a way to usher in the ones that are good? That could be it as well. Could be a number of things. Regardless of what it is, you have to stay privy to what's happening, what's being said. It also makes me think of the movie Alien versus Predator, because if this is basically a good alien versus bad alien situation, what were they trying to message? What message were they trying to send to us in that movie? You know, if the only way to destroy these predators is with aligning ourselves with the extraterrestrials that are good, then that's something could also be used to drive a certain narrative as well. So many types of possibilities. Definitely unfortunate that it's happening to this community. So we'll definitely keep watching this and keep posted. I want to talk about this Jamie Foxx anti-Semitism post, because I think that we can take note of a certain agenda that's being pushed inside of the mainstream discourse, something that's not being done accidentally, that's being done on purpose. So let's read through this article. It says, in anti-Semitism discourse. And by the way, just for context, this I believe was posted by it was posted by the Times of Israel. Usually a newspaper I would not report from or read from, but I want you to hear what they're saying about this. So they said, an anti-Semitism discourse around Jamie Foxx's Jesus post, evidence of a culture clash. And let me set the ground for you. If any of you don't know, I hope you do know, but Jamie Foxx basically tweeted something, and you don't have to know because you might just not be someone that pays attention to celebrity culture, so good for you. But Jamie Foxx, the actor, posted something on social media of the nature saying, if they hated Jesus, they'll hate you too. Something I've heard, never thought of much of it as far as communities that they're talking about. Well, he posted this and it was accused of being anti-Semitic. So it says, in the immediate aftermath of Foxx's post, multiple Jewish groups called him out. Stop Anti-Semitism, a watchdog with 72,000 Twitter followers, posted a screenshot of the Jesus post, wrote, did Kanye hack Jamie Foxx's Instagram account? That was a reference to the rapper and fashion mogul formerly known as Kanye West, who went on an anti-Semitic tirade last year. After Foxx apologized, yes, he apologized, even though we know that the phrase has nothing to do with the Untouchables. But after Foxx apologized, Stop Anti-Semitism tweeted, words matter. And those with massive audiences on social media have a responsibility to be careful with their content to not incite more hatred than already exists. I'm going to actually stop right there. So to be very clear, I think most of us who've heard this phrase, we know actually that it's a reference to a scripture where Yeshua tells us that if the world hated me, they'll hate you too. So obviously this is not something talking about a certain community. It's again talking about the world. Don't expect to be loved in the world when our Savior was not loved in the world. So the phrase has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, but these people feel like they can say that it doesn't matter what you intend. It doesn't matter what it means to you. It only matters what it means to us. Forget you and your autonomy. Forget your right to express yourself. So forget your right to state something according to your culture and your background. It only matters what we say and what we call a certain thing. That's all that matters. So accept it because we rule you. We are first. We are supreme. Accept it. That's the same attitude that we've essentially been given. And unfortunately, because some of our people keep apologizing, that they feel that they have leverage to actually come to us with such dictatorial conduct. So it says Foxx again apologized. On Saturday, the American Jewish Committee released a statement referencing the initial post in the apology. It praised Foxx's apology, and you also stop being loving praise from these people so much, and conveyed that the Jesus post was anti-Semitic regardless of his intent. So let me understand this. Something that is being said, it doesn't matter what's being said or what's meant. It's anti-Semitic just because you say it is. This is actually crazy, but unfortunately, again, many of our people are living by their rules. So Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, tweeted on Sunday, we welcome The apology, we thank him, Jamie Foxx's apology, we thank him for his clarification. The group also wished him health following his recent hospitalization. Bling Black tweeted on Sunday that he spoke to Foxx, and Foxx confirmed privately what he had said publicly. His message of love for the Jewish community is crucial in this time of rising hate. The groups that criticize Foxx have stood by their statements, okay? Despite the fact that I think our people were very loud in saying this is not anti-Semitic. Our people were very clear in saying, we've all said this, we don't even think of that community. They said that they're standing by their statements, that it is, so accept it. In the email to the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, a spokesperson for the American Jewish Committee wrote that the group's reaction was warranted because Foxx's post could have been read as anti-Semitic regardless of what he meant. It is important to continue to educate and explain why something may be interpreted as anti-Semitic, as the spokesperson wrote. Foxx has 16.7 million followers. We do not know how they will interpret and internalize the comment. It is so imperative to call out statements that can be anti-Semitic. So we're in a situation, obviously, where it doesn't matter what we say because we don't have power, which I think we all know. We don't have power inside of this conversation. One group does have power in this conversation. So what they say goes. It's not just for Jamie Foxx. This is for you if you're employed by the system. This is for you if you're in the system. Basically, what they say goes. So deal with it or face ramifications. And this is what many of our people are dealing with. The reason I wanted to cover this story is because I think, first of all, it's not a coincidence that our people of all people have been given this label. You know, we've seen it over and over again. Articles being put out, of course, they always have to use our people whenever they want to put stuff out like this, but saying that Black people are becoming the face of anti-Semitism. I think they even said Black men are becoming the face of anti-Semitism. This is the narrative that's being peddled. It's not a coincidence. It's not by happenstance. And we're going to see more and more of those type of articles or more and more of those type of discourse being put out about us, particularly as the times draw nearer to an end. Because the more, first of all, that many of us wake up to not just who we are, but who they are, and not just who they are, where they are, the place that they're calling Israel, Palestine, the more that we wake up to the fact that the truth, the more that we wake up to the truth, the more that they're going to have to attack us. And the attacks are going to be more frequent. Attacks are going to be more apparent. They're trying to do everything that they can to emasculate our men so that they don't fight back. And so not just our men, our people, they want our people to not fight back. So be ready for that. Understand it. Understand if you're working and living in a system, be prepared. Have yourself exit plan, because if they control your livelihood, don't think that you won't face a similar result or a similar consequence as what Jamie Foxx also suffered, because his career depends on the same people that misinterpreted his post. So we have one more story. This is a very similar story because Uganda is now inside of a situation where, because they have adopted a law, a country, sovereign country adopted a law, and because the international community is against the law, they are now going to face ramifications from the World Bank. So Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni on Wednesday accused the World Bank of pressing his country to abandon its anti-homosexuality law. Ugandans will develop with or without loans. Okay, Mr. Museveni slammed on Twitter, renamed X after the World Bank suspended all new loans to Kampala because of an anti-homosexuality law enacted by the president on May 29th. And I want to just say this again. Museveni historically has not stood his ground like this. So that's needed context. It's also needed context that he's very old. I mean, this man, I forget the age. I believe he's Africa's oldest president. But he's actually standing his ground on this. Again, he's Africa's oldest president. Maybe he feels like going out strong. And he says that Uganda will develop with loans or without loans. That's a very powerful statement, especially whenever you have an understanding that this development, so-called development that's happening with loans, is not true development of the people's resources, the people's land, the people's capacity, but it's actually an underdevelopment of the people's capacity, the people's land, people's resources. So it goes on to say, it is therefore regrettable that the World Bank, this is Museveni again, and others are trying to pressure us to abandon our faith, culture, principles, and sovereignty using money, he added. We don't need pressure from anyone to know how to solve the problems of our society, which is the basic thing. And to me personally, if you're anti-imperialism, you have to be anti the World Bank or the US trying to force a sovereign country to adopt laws that sovereign country does not want to adopt. Now it says, it also stated, so the later announced on Tuesday that no new public financing for Uganda would be submitted to its board of directors as the anti-homosexuality law comes into force in the country in 2023, runs counter to its values. Consultations are still ongoing between the Ugandan government and the World Bank on issues surrounding the anti-homosexuality law. Uganda Information Minister Chris Barromunsi told AFP on Wednesday. However, the World Bank and others should be reminded that Uganda is a sovereign country, making decisions in the interest of its people, and this is the spirit of the anti-homosexuality law. That's what they're saying. It's a sovereignty issue, and that's what it is to me. Let me be very clear. There's some things about this law I do not agree with. The biggest thing I don't agree with is trying to making it the law that if you suspect someone is practicing homosexuality, that you will be arrested for not reporting them, because I don't like seeing a situation where we're being forced to be a reporter of the brethren in that situation. So I don't love the law either, but I absolutely respect Uganda's right to sovereignty, Uganda's right to create laws that it wants to create for its people. And because I would not have the same energy to go to, let's say, and many people who also have this energy for Uganda would not have the same energy to go to the Middle East, would not have the same energy to go to, many of those countries that we view as sovereign. We don't have the energy for them, but we have the energy for Africa. That tells you that if you have that same energy, you don't have that same energy, then maybe you have been manipulated by the colonial narrative to think that Africa is not deserving of the same sovereignty as other people are. Vladimir Putin just enacted a law, an anti-trans law. Do you hear the same people who are so upset? Well, many people might be because they're anti-Russia right now, but overwhelmingly, we don't hear the same international outcry because Russia is viewed as a sovereign country. But unfortunately, countries in the African continent are not viewed as sovereign. So when Obama marches up inside of an African-US summit when he was president and says, we're not going to talk to any countries that don't do what we say you're going to do as far as homosexuality, and they wouldn't talk, I believe they banned Zimbabwe. Would he have done that same thing in the Middle East? That is a huge question. In Arabia, would he have done that same thing? Of course not. So he's positioning himself to lecture African countries because he doesn't respect African countries. And if you respect African countries, you'll respect the fact that they are going to figure out their problems on their own way. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with every single law written. So that is really it for this week. Big takeaway, obviously, the World Bank is up to shenanigans, but good for Uganda, saying that we're willing to develop with or without it. Frankly, regardless of you're facing sanction or not, it would be in the best interest of the people if all of Africa had that stance. But unfortunately, we know that's not going to happen because many of those people getting paid for the countries that are getting paid those loans, the actual leaders are having it going to their pocket. And so many of them are going to follow suit with the international agenda. But that's all I have with this video. I thank you all for watching. I'll see you on the next video.
Gave monotheism to the world, belief in one God. And at the time that Africa gave monotheism to the world, belief in one God, every other area surrounding Africa were believing in cows, were believing in moons, were believing in the sun. It was Africa and Africa alone that gave monotheism to the world. That is why Judaism had to be born in Africa. It presented the proper conditions for Judaism to be born there. Sigmund Freud, in his book Moses and Monotheism, his last book, and the book usually hidden, it's hard to get, and I don't see why. I find the book to be a particularly interesting book, and the conditions under which it were written. Mr. Freud began to write the book, I believe, in Austria, and because of Nazi occupation, he had to leave, and he took all the notes with him and went to Britain and hurried very much to write the book. Of course, this book, the Moses and Monotheism, here Freud comes to show through archaeological proofs, Freud comes to show through historical proof, So Freud comes to through psychoanalytical proof that Judaism began in Africa, and not only this, but Moses himself was an African. Of course, the early priests of the religion were Africans, as they had to be. They were the ones who recorded the religion. Thus, when I take a position against Zionism, for example, when I hear people tell me that I'm anti-Semitic, which makes no sense at all because Judaism has nothing to do with Semitic people. One is a religion, the other is a biological specification, and the Palestinians certainly are Semitic. Mr. Arafat is a Semite. So if I support the Palestinians, I cannot be anti-Semitic, that's clear. But this is all confusion here. And this confusion is well done to keep people more confused. But we're revolutionaries and we believe in dialectics. Out of confusion comes clarity. Because our time is limited and we want a lot of time for question, we want to make it clear. Judaism was given to the world by Africa. This is clear and undeniable fact. Those who wish to look at the history and we can develop it, look. Zionism is a political philosophy. It did not come out of Africa. The first organizational conference of Zionism, if my memory serves me correctly, was in 1897 in a place called Bâle, Switzerland. B-A-L-S-E. The reason why this meeting had to be held in Bâle, Switzerland was because the majority of Orthodox Jewry in Europe was against Zionism, totally against it. We must look properly at Zionism, its beginning, and its founder, a man by the name of Theodor Herzl, H-E-R-Z-L. Mr. Herzl was, of course, bourgeois from his toes to his top of his head. He was bourgeois. As bourgeois as you can get. He didn't think about the proletarian. As a matter of fact, Mr. Herzl himself was not a religious person. It's extremely important. And we want to read his diary. He himself says that he's an atheist. You must understand the word properly. An atheist does not just not believe in God. An atheist makes the affirmative statement that God does not exist. Thus, Mr. Herzl is an atheist. I could never understand, until this day it is incomprehensible for me to understand. How is it that Zionism, a political philosophy, born thousands of miles away from Judaism, one born in Africa, the other in Europe, born thousands of years different from Africa, thousands of years difference, Judaism thousands of years ago, Zionism 1897. And how is it that they can link each other together? And according to the philosophy of Zionism, that they feel that somehow that they have some relationship to Judaism and this promised state that God promised his chosen people. Mr. Herzl did not believe in God. Not only did not believe in God, he said that God did not exist. Now, he who tells me that God does not exist sets out to find a place that God promised to his chosen people. If this is not ludicrous, and this is the basis, of course, of Zionism, so you can see here the contradictions just everywhere. This is the time when Zionism comes to rise. Zionism comes to look for a state when everywhere else in the world is already dominated. Thus, in order for Mr. Herzl to get a country for Zionists, what he did was to attach himself to imperialism, British imperialism in this case, quite specifically. Of course, as an African who suffered under the heels of British imperialism, I can have no love for it, and certainly I cannot love anyone who attaches themselves to it and attaches themselves to it for the foundation of a state and then call this a liberation movement. Liberation movements fight against imperialism, not with it. Clearly here. Yes. The legal foundation of the State of Israel is what is known as the Balfour Declaration. This declaration was issued in 1917. A man in the government of Britain named Balfour wrote a paper and promised the Jews a national home. The national home he promised them was an area which Britain was colonizing, Palestine. Palestine didn't belong to the British. Just like Ireland doesn't belong to the British, even though they have troops there. But here, these British imperialists signed a note and gave it to the Jews and they accepted it. Where is the morality for this? If you say that Israel belongs to you, then you don't go to a thief to get Israel, you go and take it. Once you go to an immoral being such as British imperialism, and this is the basis for you getting the land, then clearly here those who are truly liberation fighters must question this. The basis, we say, is the Balfour Declaration, and Zionists know it. Because Zionism is certainly not a liberation movement, because it never fought against any imperialism. As a matter of fact, today, Zionism is the baby, child, and infant protector of imperialism in the Middle East. It carries out the interests of American imperialism. As a matter of fact, Zionism and American imperialism is like this. If our tax dollars would stop giving money to Israel, the state would sink tomorrow. And certainly no one can deny that American imperialism is the leading imperialist nation in the world. So we cannot see how a liberation movement is so tied, string and ham to American imperialism. They work hand in hand with American imperialism. Thus they can hardly be a liberation movement.